If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine, and maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them, from disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. This week we have 2 episodes. I'm your speaker Casey, and I have a few things to get through before we start. First of all, thank you to everyone who joined in with last month's monthly memoir giveaway. You can now purchase a copy of Helen's ebook yourself for only 99 cents if you live in the States. We have a new book to celebrate across December, and that is Lisa Cohn's To the Moon and Back, A Childhood Under the Influence, a coming-of-age memoir about Lisa's time spent in the Unification Church. You can go back and listen to an interview with Lisa, where we discuss her life and her book, on episode 91 of the podcast. To get involved in this monthly memoir giveaway of Lisa's book, simply comment, follow, and like any posts on my social media pages across the month of December. You can find me at Cult Vault Pod on Twitter and Instagram. Also, a massive thank you and welcome to our newest patron, Heather. Welcome on board. I hope you enjoy the exclusive content. I have added your name to my list of sponsors on the podcast website, and I look forward to bringing you and the others more episodes each month. Also, thank you to Amanda, who has increased her Patreon pledge. And as a token of my huge appreciation to all of my patrons, each of you has been offered a copy of Helen Zuman's Mating in Captivity across the month of December, as well as an exclusive Cult Vault bookmark. You can become a patron from as little as £1 a month at patreon.com/The Cult Vault. December marks my first listener challenge. I am asking each listener to recommend the podcast to family and friends and help me to get to 300,000 downloads before New Year's Eve. If we can do this, I will be releasing 2 episodes a week in January instead of the usual 1. And lastly, I am so excited to announce that I will be joining CrimeCon 2022 in London in June on Podcast Row. Come and join me, come and take part. You can get 10% off admission prices by using the code CULTLIVE. All patrons can get 15% off with a special code. And if anyone is interested in coming down and getting involved, I would love to see you there. Now let's get to today's second show. I am so incredibly excited to bring to you author Nicola Ranson, who has written a very insightful memoir called A Slice of Orange, depicting her time spent following Guru Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. Nicola has had a very varied life, full of many experiences that she has managed to tie up into one book. This memoir is a look into life in the 70s, into a life of artistic calling, into a life spent partially on a ranch in Oregon. I hope you all find Nicola as wonderful as I do. Here is our in-depth chat about her work, A Slice of Orange. So hello Nicola, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today. I am really excited to discuss at length this memoir that you have written and sent to me and given me the opportunity to read, and to bring some of this information over to the listeners. So would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi, Casey. I'm Nicola Ranson, and I'm a writer and a psychotherapist, and I live in San Diego, California, and I came here by way of England and Canada, and I'm just really excited to be here.
And today we're going to be talking about your memoir, A Slice of Orange. Can you give us the premise of your book?
Okay. So A Slice of Orange covers the 10 years that I wore orange as a disciple of the Guru Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. I went to his ashram in India in 79, and then afterwards lived on the commune in Oregon, known as Rajneeshpuram. And the memoir covers my time leading up to that and the time afterwards and a lot of the good times in between.
And I when I was reading your book, the first thing that I realized was that, first of all, I think it's very witty. There's some very very witty moments, and some quite tongue-in-cheek moments as well. And I thought it was interesting that at some points during the book, some people were telling you that you take yourself too seriously. And I was like, well, that is not the impression that I have had kind of reading this work. But then obviously nobody knows your inner monologue at that point. You're kind of keeping a lot of that stuff, especially before going to India, is kind of like all kept inside. So I thought that was really interesting, that people thought that you were a very serious person, because the writing kind of didn't reflect that. But on another side to that was that when there were serious themes and moments within the book, the juxtaposition between kind of like the humor and the wittiness kind of pulled you back into the kind of severity of some of the situations, because the kind of the tone changed to like, okay, so now this has happened. And I thought that was really interesting as well. It kind of reminded me of like when I watch a comedy program that I love, and you're like, wow, the characters are so fun and cool, and you're slowly introduced to them, and then something kind of serious happens to one of the characters, and you're like, oh no, but that's not, so that's kind of like that was my initial feelings and thoughts as I was getting kind of more into the book, and anybody that goes on to have a little read will understand exactly that feeling. I mean, that's my interpretation anyway.
I'm very happy to hear that, and I have had that feedback that it's funny, and I think that makes it a lot easier to read for starters. And I think that the difference between, the kid who's growing up and experiencing these things, it's a different perspective when you're going back and reflecting on it. So I would imagine the humor is perhaps a little more evident in the writer's voice going back on it.
What would you say your early years were like before your first visit to India? I know there's a lot covered in the book that we probably can't summarize in 2 or 3 sentences. But I wondered if you could just give the listeners a brief insight to perhaps life with your parents before you moved away for the first time.
Well, I was born in Rugby in England, and I felt like it was a pretty happy kid's life. You don't really know any other life other than the one you have at that age. It was a middle-class life. I had a rabbit and a doll's house and friends, and some somewhat uninvolved parents, I would say. But I had my own little world and lived a lot in my imagination and playing with my puppet theater and so on. And that was rather disrupted when my family emigrated. So when I was 10, my family emigrated to Canada, and a lot shifted. And part of that was really being far more exposed to being simply with my parents, with no extended family and no community and no familiar school and so on. And my parents were not particularly happy, especially under the stresses of immigration. And Canada, I eventually adjusted and ended up in a convent school, which was great for me because I wasn't living with my parents and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I always longed to return to England. Immigration was not something I'd chosen, and I felt like I never really fit in or adapted. And I had a lot of illness. I had a condition called ulcerative colitis that started when I was 10. So I don't think it was a huge coincidence that that's when we emigrated. So I always longed to go back to England. And as soon as I was independent enough to have enough money to buy an airplane ticket, that's what I did. So I moved back to the UK and traveled for a while and ended up going to university there.
And when you saved up that money and took that first kind of leap into a life independent from your parents, do you know what age you were?
Well, I bought the ticket at, 17, 18. But I hadn't lived with my parents since I was 13 because I was at convent school. I just went home on the weekends. And then afterwards I went to a junior college. So I had an apartment with friends in downtown Montreal at age 16. So that was all pretty independent. And then it was just a natural trajectory, just wanting get back and fly away on my own. And it was a time when feminism was just beginning, and my brothers had gone off hitchhiking and they'd gone off traveling. So why couldn't I? And I did.
It was interesting what you said in the book about everybody hitchhikes. That's just the way that people get around. There's kind of no really, like, if you had money for the bus, why would you use that money when you could just hitchhike? And even more interesting was the comment about how, in your experience at least, you know, it was always the women that found it easier to hitchhike than the men. So often there'd be queues of people and you were supposed to kind of go in the order of how long you'd been waiting for. But then you kind of like just jump in and before anyone has a chance to get angry at you and say, you're not the first in line. And I thought that was really interesting, especially when I've listened to a lot of true crime podcasts and coverage on various stories in the 70s when hitchhiking was kind of like at an all-time high, and a lot of victims would be picked up by people driving vehicles and lorries and HGVs and trucks, and that was my kind of perception of hitchhiking was, oh my goodness, it's so dangerous because of all these things that have happened to people, and all of these horrible hitchhiking stories that I've heard on all of these different media platforms. And then kind of reading your story gave me like almost a different insight into the world of hitchhiking, and actually how for people that hadn't had those negative experiences, it was just something quite ordinary, really, and quite normal for a lot of people.
I think that's part of what I intended in presenting the journey, you know, trying to bring that era and time really to life in terms of someone's personal experience. Because as a kid, and I use kid to include a great many years, actually, I was tremendously naive, and I would have a fit now if I had a daughter who was hitchhiking. You know, we know so much more, but at the time, I don't know literally if it was any more dangerous than it is now, but we didn't hear about those things that much. You know, and of course, there's a reason girls and women were picked up faster than the men, and that's part of the danger. You know, it was a dangerous thing to be doing, but we were naive, and so were our parents. No, the parents didn't give it a second thought. Just let, kids go off, be independent, you know, and it was part, I think, of the zeitgeist that was actually good parenting, that you want your kids to be as independent as possible. So if they're off doing their own thing, you succeeded. That was certainly part of how my parents saw it.
It's almost the opposite now because of phones and technology and tracking and all of this stuff. It's almost like helicopter parenting has taken over from almost liberal parenting. I don't know what the right word would be to describe kind of
exactly. Yeah, the pendulum's gone the other way for sure. Mm-hmm.
Early on in the book, you mentioned that before you enrolled in university, you did some traveling, and just to paint a picture for the listeners in terms of stepping stones and events that led you over to eventually visiting India. I wondered if you could just briefly talk the listeners through your experience of your first travels around some parts of the world.
Right. Well, I was so innocent that when I set off traveling, I had a world map. And that was the map I had, with just the countries colored in with no roads. And that's how I was planning on getting around. And I had the good fortune to have met up with my cousin Kate in England, who's been a dear, dear friend. And she had the same goals as I did. She'd been kicked out of school, I think. So she was 17 and I was 18. And we just set off, not quite sure where we were headed, but we'd saved enough money to be able to go. And we thought we'd stay in hostels, but that didn't turn out very well. And we ended up in somewhere where I would not advise my daughters to go, certainly not hitchhiking. And that was Morocco, which is a pretty dangerous place for young women. And with various adventures, we ended up in the Sahara Desert, and I was held prisoner and raped. So it was a very, very traumatic time, and I was very, very, very lucky to get out alive, which I did, and ended up, while I was away, having the extraordinary phone conversation to tell me I'd been accepted at university, which was something I really, really wanted before I left. And this is university in England at Bristol. But having been in that near-death situation, it was pretty surreal that, oh, next stop is university. But I had to find my way back to my angry parents in Canada, who were not at all happy that I'd gone to Africa. And it really was a very large disturbance, as it is anyone who goes through that sort of experience at a very young age in particular. But one of the factors that made it a lot worse was my parents' lack of comprehension or sensitivity. And basically my mother she never forgave me for that. And she was just so upset that it happened. So I think it led to a lot of shutting down for me. And when I did go to university, which was a great experience, there was something that I felt sort of was disconnected from, the happy, joyful, exploratory person I would have been without having had that experience.
And I think that's certainly reflected in your writing, and was absolutely one of those first moments where the tone of the book changed from the whimsical and witty through to kind of like the despair and the terror, and it was kind of it was heavy to read. It kind of felt like so you had something like a heavy backpack or something on your shoulders as you were going through, and kind of like getting through the difficult pages in the book where the abuse took place, and then that profound moment where you found out the news that you'd been accepted into university, and had that moment where you realized that it just didn't seem like a big deal or anything to celebrate, and you weren't sure how you felt about it because it seemed so insignificant in light of what just happened. And that was kind of like a moment for me. Reading the book was kind of it put into perspective the severity of exactly what had happened. I was thinking, I wonder if that continues to happen today in the same place. I don't know if that's something that you still think about, whether there were other people that went through that place and the same thing happened.
I did look it up on the web when I was writing, and I found that there is a Me Too movement in Morocco. And I think that helped me really want to express it too, because this had happened to a number of other people going through the same village, because the person who raped me was the chief of police who gave the visas. And so I guess I wanted to call that out. And I don't know what the situation is now, but it's not something I would want to go back and find out. And basically I have a PTSD response still. And my work now as a psychotherapist specializes in trauma. So I've really explored this area pretty thoroughly, and it helps me a lot with supporting other people who've been through similar situations, because it's so common in one form or another. And I know when people undergo trauma, they often say, oh, of course, my trauma was nothing compared to other people's trauma. And I feel that way too. When I talk to people who've been serially raped or have had difficult incest experiences, difficult, of course, that goes with incest. Mine was one incident, and I see how much that messed up my life. So my heart really goes out to people who have dealt with that and want to heal from experiences like that. And a lot of my work has helped people.
What would you say is a correct or sensitive response to somebody that does come to you and confides that information, because often we do have people come on the show and talk about those experiences, and it always worries me that the reactions or questions from me that follow are either come across as insensitive or incorrect. And I always, it's hard because I feel like no words you say could ever really summarize how you feel for somebody when you hear that they've been through that. And it's hard because you don't want to say, I'm so sorry, because I don't feel like that's enough to really help that person understand actually how deeply sorry you may feel that has happened. I'm not sure if that makes sense at all.
Oh, it makes wonderful sense. And it actually makes me feel that you are a very responsible person to hear those stories by means of even having that question. I think you're doing a service when you ask to hear someone's story. And if someone's actually at the place where they're ready and wanting to volunteer and coming to talk to you, they're getting some benefit from telling it. So I think the first thing is the listening itself is of great value, and the quality of listening and be able to be present and just be yourself and hear someone and sit with that discomfort and that compassion and those feelings. That goes a really long way. And you're in a professional role of listening and helping people tell their stories. So of course you have to ask whatever relevant questions. So it sounds to me like you're doing a great job. And if you have any concerns about having said the wrong thing, would just follow up afterwards.
That's great advice. And it will most likely be helpful for some of the listeners as well, who may have loved ones involved in high demand control groups or domestic abuse relationships, or anything that comes with handling sensitive information that somebody may come to you with. And just to let them know that if they're not sure how to respond or what the correct response is when somebody confides something so personal and vulnerable about themselves to you, is that maybe just being there and being open to receiving that communication is the best thing that you can do for that person.
Absolutely. And you can always ask the question, how can I support you? What would be helpful? What would you like from me right now? And then you're giving that responsibility back to the other person. I mean, with my mother, she was angry and she blamed me for being raped. And how could you have been so stupid as to have been in that situation, et cetera, et cetera. And now that I'm more mature, hopefully, certainly older, I have a lot more compassion for her, because I can see that's because it was just too painful for her to deal with and take in. And it triggered whatever it triggered, for her. But it severed our relationship because I had enough self-blame to start with. You already feel pretty stupid for getting yourself in a stupid situation like that. So you don't really need someone else telling that. So I think you're quite right that dealing with cults and so on. And in my memoir, I mentioned that my parents had gone to an anti-cult organization and got some literature and said, how do you deal with your child when you're in a cult? And I've still got the letter they wrote. And the piece from the organization, and the piece of information that they absorbed was, don't ever tell the cult victim, I told you so. And my parents absorbed that. And given their sort of natural history of, it's sort of a family culture to sort of say, oh, it's your fault. And there was a lot of blaming. For my parents to not say, I told you so, made an immense difference for me coming out, because I was it's such an acute vulnerability, such as you're describing. You're just so vulnerable. You don't know what way is up. So to anything that smacks of judgment and condemnation really comes through much, much louder than the person might intend. So you basically bite your lip, shut up, and listen.
Often I've found at times when people speak about their initial exit from their group or movement as well, that they have that own guilt, self-blame and condemnation themselves. They are putting back on themselves for decisions they feel they may be responsible for, which I always try to tell them is probably almost always not the case. But of course, that's something that people can't help. And I think if you are your own worst enemy at that point, to have your family and friends and people to tell you the same at that time it can't be helpful in any way.
Exactly.
And it was hard for me. This is kind of similar to Ronit Plank's story, and she's an author who wrote a memoir called When She Comes Back, about her mother going to follow the same guru. And what I found interesting about her writing is that I wanted to be angry at Ronit's mum because I was in love with the protagonist and her voice as an author. But of course I couldn't be, because she wasn't, and she has so much love and compassion, and there is forgiveness, and now there is unity, and they have a beautiful relationship now, which I was lucky to kind of get some background insight to before we hit the record button. It was all very wholesome, and the same with your writing. I wanted to be so angry at your parents for the way that they dismissed you sometimes when you really needed them to see you. And it's hard when when you're reading it from the author's perspective, but then the author says, like, but I love them and they're my family, and you're like, yep, they are, and you're right, so we can't really be angry, we just need some space. And that's kind of like a little bit of how I felt when I was reading those segments with your parents as well. So you go off traveling, and in your book you kind of talk us through the experience of being stuck in Africa, but eventually being able to find your way home, and spending that short period of time back with your parents before coming over for university. And you've already mentioned it was the University of Bristol. And what degree was it that you had chosen to study?
Drama and English.
So you took them, was it one course or two separate courses that were added together to make one degree?
It's called a joint degree. So it's basically like getting a degree in each department.
And which of those two did you prefer over the other?
Oh, certainly drama. And that's very much because the English turned out to be literary criticism. I'd gone in thinking, oh, it's going to help me write. I want to learn to write. And instead I found it extremely dry. And in the drama department, it was all about exploration and discovery and adventure. And I just found the sense of belonging also with the students who were attracted to theatre.
I really enjoyed reading about it because of my own personal experience in drama. When you talked about kind of going into that world where anybody could be anything, and the costumes and the makeup and everybody's just, it's just like a different environment completely, and that made me feel really nostalgic, and I could almost smell it. When you walk into a room and everybody takes their socks and shoes off, and the rooms that I grew up in, they all had black walls and black carpet and black blinds, so that when you had your blackout moments, the room was totally black, and I could smell that room when I was reading your work. So that was really quite impactful for me. And you stayed for 3 years to do this joint degree?
That's right. And then I stayed on for a while afterwards. It was a very, very exciting time. And I think the context of the 70s, is very much part of this memoir. And part of that was people were not so pressured to go to university to find a career. And in fact, I really wish I had been given a bit more help in finding a career. It was more about, exploring and discovering the truth, etc. So you sort of had to muddle your own way towards career.
And a few things happened during your time at university that kind of point you in the direction that eventually leads to you heading over to India. And I don't want to give all of the details away, because I really want people to go and read this book, because like you said, it's the start, middle and end of your entire journey. And for anybody that's interested in the whole thing, kind of like somebody's personal insight into following Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh in India and in Oregon, and not just seeing it from a documentary's perspective, but from a personal individual perspective of somebody that attended. I've never had that until reading your work, Nicola. So I really do want people to go and read it. But I kind of also want to paint the picture for them of your journey, like a bird's eye view, without any of the bits in the middle, and people will have to go and read to find out all of those bits. But 2 or 3 things happened that kind of push you in that direction, and I wondered if you could just kind of give us a brief introduction to those things.
Well, I think I was fascinated by humanistic psychology, which is part of that era, and there was this big connection between self-discovery and theatre. And the kind of theatre that I was really drawn to was a sort of spiritual theatre, for want of better words. And there was a man called Jerzy Grotowski from Poland, who was sort of the great teacher in this arena. And it was about, trying to express the inexpressible and trying to put the invisible on stage, and all this work around opening up your body and expanding, which coincided with what the human potential movement was doing in therapy groups, and these physical forms of the Reichian work where you're breaking your own constrictions and coming free. So all that really fascinated me. And it was also a time of drugs and rock and roll and a lot of fun. But it was really, for me, it's what I would call a spiritual journey. And I consider my memoir a spiritual memoir. So there were various colorful experiences that you're alluding to that took me further along that path of, what's really going to get me to truth, whatever that is. But it felt like heightened experience where I could be more than ordinary daily life, touch into something of what the potential it was to be alive and human, and to fully live and be joyful. And I think, I'd come from a very conservative family in many ways, and I didn't express myself with confidence. I was very sort of scared to do so. So the theater program really helped open that up and blessed creativity. Here is a cauldron, which maybe you experienced also, of just creativity being given permission. So I could get together with a group of people, we'd come up with a wacky show and we'd put it on. And there was this sense of exploration and also unity. Because I think, when we talk about cults, it's a generally pejorative term. And I don't necessarily see it that way. I see it as a way of looking at, mini cultures. And my understanding too of a leader or a guru, I sort of could understand by comparing, 2 amazing theatrical experiences where people gave everything and they worked on something for months and months or years and years and created an end product that literally could transform the lives of people who were in it or people who were watching. And that was to do with the commitment of the group and the trust in the leadership. A play is not a democratic event. It's usually an autocratic event with various levels of democracy, but there needs to be some organization that brings it into a coherent shape so that people can pull it off cooperatively. And that's part of the high of doing something like that.
I'd never considered a theatre piece to be in conjunction with something like building the ranch, especially in terms of, there was a documentary I watched about Jonestown and everybody that attended Jonestown before Jim Jones arrived there, talking about how they were part of something bigger than themselves, and they were the people involved in building utopia with their own hands, and they were able to use skills that they had developed since living over there that they'd never even thought they'd be able to do. And they worked round the clock for hours and hours, 18-hour days, kind of working themselves to the bone, but they didn't mind because they were building something themselves from nothing. And that's the same impression I got watching the Netflix documentary series that I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later on, when it came to Rancho Rajneesh as well. And I never really thought about the similarities between a production and building something from nothing, and having the lighting technicians and the sound engineers and the costume designers and the makeup department. And then, the actors and the script and the director and the stage manager and all of those things that go with putting a production on. And even if none of those things exist and it's just a group of people performing, and there's no costumes and there's no sound and there's no lighting, it's still all of those things that are building something from nothing as a unit, and being part of that and seeing your work and being able to show your work to other people and say, look at what we've built together from nothing. And I've never really drawn a comparison between the two until you've just said that. So that's I've had a few profound moments this week, and I'm having another one right now, and I don't really know, I might need to go and start a journal after this week, because I'm having a few things, but yeah, that's really, really interesting to contemplate.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because to me it's part of my motivation in writing this memoir, is to give the access to what is it like for someone who becomes involved in a group like this? Because I think it's so much human nature to dismiss the other, and dismiss especially cult people. Oh, and if it's a sensational cult, it's like, how could those people have been so stupid? And I really want to normalize that experience, because the research is that people who join cults are much like anybody else. And I think if we can identify things like you're saying, oh, well, that was a real high to me. I really enjoyed the end production. I really enjoyed working with other people. You do get a sense of this group high and the seductivity of that. And I think you nailed it when you said being involved with something larger than oneself. I think that is the main appeal. That's something that takes us out of our smaller daily selves towards self with a big S, something that feels more significant.
I was just reminded of an interview that I had with author Lisa, who wrote a book about her time involved in the Unification Church called To the Moon and Back. And she has moments where she would go around with her pin of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and people would kind of be a bit wary about approaching her or being near her, because they could see that she was affiliated with what was openly being called a cult at that time, or people were worried, and there were articles in newspapers about the dangers of the Moonies, and so that then what you said about not wanting to approach somebody that's aligned with a cult is what that reminded me of with Lisa's work then. And there are a few moments in the book where it feels like you cannot get away from the orange people. They are everywhere. They seem to be kind of, whatever your next natural step is in life, you're like, oh, there's more orange people here. And I can't seem to go anywhere without seeing these people dressed in orange. So for anyone who might not know what an orange person is, would you like to kind of give us a quick breakdown?
Well, Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh had this agreement with people who wanted to become his disciples that they would become what was called sannyasin, which is the Hindi word for renunciate. And that's what we called ourselves, sannyasins. The media called us Rajneeshis. And the agreement was you would wear the mala, which are beads around your neck with his picture, and you would wear orange, or it ended up anything on that spectrum. So in Oregon, it actually was more red, but you could wear pink or purple or something of those colors. And all the clothes were those colors, your underwear, your socks, etc. So people did really stand out on the street. And I did, as my interest in him grew, I just kept being magnetically drawn to these bright, sunshiny people who seemed to be everywhere.
And I loved one of the moments in the book where somebody was like, "Oh, I can recommend you this B&B. It's run by a sannyasin," and you're like, "Of course it is. Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be at this point? Of course it is." So how do you first become involved with the movement itself? Your first kind of like, okay, then I'm going to go and see what it's all about.
Meeting the people and then asking them questions and starting to read the books. So Rajneesh, who's now known as Osho, he's deceased, but he's known as Osho. He's the same person as the person that's called Osho currently, lectured a great deal. And his lectures were written into books. So he had a lot of books around, and they really corresponded to what my beliefs were at the time, about letting go of attachment in order to move to greater awareness, and how to become more loving. And he spoke of wanting to create a community where people were not limited by the social norms that had been restricted. So he said that, and I really want it to be seen in the context of that era too, that it wasn't like something coming in that was alien. It really fit with what I see as my hippie ideals at the time. And so he was professing that, and I kept reading about him and meeting these people, and I felt really pulled, really like a visceral, physical pull. I hated the idea of a guru. Last thing I wanted to do was to surrender. That sounded like a terrible thing to me, and yet he kept drawing me, and I felt it really as an energetic presence, almost as if he was reaching out to me. And I had a boyfriend at the time who was he was a sannyasin, and he had his mala on. And at one point I said, "Oh, let me try that on." And I put it on, and I had this extraordinarily strong physiological experience of something just sort of whooshing up my body and coming out the top of my head. And it was so scary. I ripped that thing off and thought, hey, hell no, let's put that away. But it showed me there was something very powerful connected with this guru, and it really tickled my curiosity and wouldn't let go.
I was reading, and a few things happened, and I was like, when is she going to go? Because I know she's going to go, but when is she going to? And then eventually you do find yourself heading over to India to meet the guru in person and to see the community that had been built. But all of those things you said about his Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh's kind of ideologies matched your hipster ideologies at the time. The things that you said kind of even sound great to me in this day and age, to break down walls and to love each other more and to be more open and to have peace. And I think if somebody came to me and said, this is what I want to see in the world, I'd be like, that sounds great. What could there possibly be wrong with those things that you're telling me? And of course, it's like I often say with Dianetics, when you read some portions of that and apply it to human life on a basic level, as kind of guidance on how to kind of manage certain situations or or, use it as a tool to guide you through, kind of much like people do with biblical texts like the Bible or the Torah. It's kind of like, oh yeah, I can see how that might work. But then, of course, it's when you become further and further integrated, as we see in your book with the different workshops and sessions, kind of as things get a little bit deeper and deeper, it's no longer sort of those base values of like love each other and let's bring peace. And it's kind of a lot deeper and a lot more than that, which again is another very clever part of your book, because it almost does that to the reader as well. You start on this broad level of kind of meeting these sannyasins all over the place, and then you kind of go to the community where they're all there, and then we go to the workshops with you and go through all of that with you, and then it's like before we know it, we're as involved in the book as you are in the movement, and it's kind of like this really profound thing that happens. So that was something I thought was very clever and interesting about your writing as well. But you head over to India. What is that like? What is that first initial experience like of landing over in this country and finding yourself at the ashram?
Bright and shiny are the first words that come to mind. It was really exciting to be in India. It is an adventure in itself. It was such a different culture, and it was one that I felt just a lot of love for, really. And just the colors alone and the mass of different people, and it's so stimulating. And I felt this sense of homecoming, like, wow, this is so alien to my regular world, and yet I feel like I kind of belong here. And the ashram itself then was sort of an oasis within the city of Pune, which is very, very hot and dusty, and there's a lot of beggars and bullock carts and all the visual stimulation of India. And then you have this pristine ashram full of greenery and calm and peace and music and people from all over the world. That was very exciting to me. I think the Osho movement, of course, there are a lot of Indians, but it gets a bit of a rap for being predominantly white in Oregon, for sure. Not entirely. I mean, a lot of people from different countries. That was the diversity. So going into the ashram, I felt like, oh my God, who are all these people that look so happy and so radiant and so interesting? And I was 24 when I got there, and the general age was, probably about 7 or 8 years older than me. So I was sort of looking up to these, gosh, there's so many cool people in their 30s, from all different kinds of backgrounds and careers, all committed to the guru. But I saw that as being committed to themselves and their own inner work, because that's what he sold it as, that he was, and the whole tradition of gurus is about helping someone come to their own inner awakening. And it's a matter, sort of a technique, that you don't accept the guru as God. You use the guru as your way to get to God. And that was my understanding of what that was about. So it was thrilling. And Rajneesh had a lot of his first early disciples, had taught from the Europeans and Americans, had taught him about the human potential movement. And so he was really kind of unique in melding Indian spirituality with Western psychology and coming up with a whole lot of groups and workshops and meditations that were sort of a blend of the two. So that was very attractive to people like me. I mean, I'd heard about some of the therapists at the ashram and thought, gosh, if the best therapists in the world are there, that's really interesting. So that was part of the draw. And it was a very happy time. And I went through a lot of personal change and so on. But I think if it had just been that experience for me and I'd gone home and returned to my life or something, that would probably be solely positive. And a lot of people do talk about that early time in India in that same sort of light. It was fun. It was really good fun. But I was also a visitor and I was not a worker. The echelon changes as you go up in the hierarchy, and how you go from being a paying person and paying for all these groups and therapies, etc., to a worker. That's sort of the next status of, oh, I'm more committed. I just want to work here, and work is considered meditation, and I'm going to go deeper into this experiment of sannyas, whatever that is. So I never did that in India. I was just having fun, going to groups and having all these different experiences. So it was pretty positive for me.
And something that you mentioned about the hierarchy there that I found interesting in reading your book, that something that I wasn't aware of from the own research that I've done, is the difference in the malas depending on how long you'd been committed to Rajneesh. So I didn't know if that was something you could quickly explain for the listeners.
So the malas are these beads with a picture of Rajneesh, and the people who'd been with him the longest, which was actually in Bombay, now called Mumbai, before he went to Pune, they had glass malas, so an older picture of him. So that was really high status. It's like, oh, they were with him when it was just a small group around him. And then we went to, mine was sort of wooden, and that was sort of the next phase. And then I think it moved on to, I think, something different after that. So this status is a very subtle thing that sort of slips into organizations, but definitely the old sannyasins, they were high up because everything was about who was closer to him, who was in the inner circle, who was more surrendered, who was more spiritual. No, and in a subtle way. I don't think we would have named that.
It kind of keeps the and I know that this is maybe, I don't know if ironic's the right word to use, but it keeps a level of competitiveness within his followers, but also, you should be done with things like competitiveness.
Exactly.
If you're doing the work in the way that you're supposed to be, and then if you're feeling competitive, it's probably because you're not doing the work properly. And it's like this big cycle that goes round and round, which is something that I was kind of chuckling myself to when I was reading it.
So important, because if you've got a group that's about self-awareness and meditation, everything can be put on that. So anything you don't like, that's your opportunity to look at yourself. Ma, the women were known as Ma. So if you don't like something, like exactly what you're saying, oh, I'm feeling competitive because I'm really not as surrendered as so-and-so. Well, that's my stuff to look at. That was definitely the language that was used.
And then I, pay more money to go to more classes to work on those things because I've just been introduced to somebody that has a glass mala that I didn't even know was a thing, and now I'm feeling kind of like, it's a cycle, and it's so familiar. In I mentioned before we hit record, Helen Zuman's memoir Mating in Captivity, about her time on Zendik Farm, and they had coloured wristbands, and it wasn't something that she noticed for a little while, and then somebody brought up the fact that the coloured wristbands meant different things in terms of status and what you could and couldn't do on the farm and how long you'd been on the farm, or the matriarch had kind of gifted you a different colour, and a different colour meant different things, and then Helen has this moment where she's like, why do we need these? And that was her first kind of seed of doubt, where somebody said to her, like, hey, there's actually no system in place, but we all wear these coloured bands, so we're all equal, but I'm a green band and you have a blue band, and equally we've seen it in multi-level marketing companies. When we had a guest on the show called Roberta, who came to talk to us about her time in an MLM called LuLaRoe, where once you reached a certain position, in the MLM, you were gifted necklaces and bracelets and watches, and then if you went to a convention and someone had one of them watches on, oh my goodness, she has this status because she has this many people. She's at this position in the upline and has this many people underneath her in her company, and she's made this much money, so she has this special watch. And it's interesting to see that particular method transpire across various movements, but essentially have the same intention behind it.
We are so human, aren't we? Yeah, and I found it very interesting as I was writing this memoir. I read all the memoirs I could find around other cults also. And like you, just looking at the parallels is absolutely fascinating. And when you're there, you're thinking, well, I was thinking, I'm the only person who's so insecure and has such an ego, and really, I think my job is insignificant and I want to be important, and just I tortured myself with that nonsense. And what you're saying is we all go through that. Of course, we want to be closer to whatever we consider acceptance or the top.
And your integration into the community again is as I mentioned before, like on the periphery, and then very much into the insular, in terms of starting off quite tame with some of the exercises and meditations that you were taking part in, to things that for somebody on the outside looking in who had not been through those same experiences you had might seem quite strange or intense. And again, kind of is a reflection of that the base level is very different to somebody that has gone through those extra levels of becoming further and further and further involved in the movement that they are in. Like Scientology with their levels, and Rajneesh with the different workshops. And I just wondered if you could, and I don't want you to give us too much information, because this is like in the book, this is like the for people that want to learn more about progressing through those levels of commitment in a group. I think this part of the book is a very good way to understand that. So I would ask people to go and read Nicola's book for this section, as well as the kind of second half in terms of your snapping moment, that I think is quite a prevalent thing to discuss. But for anybody that hasn't watched the documentary or read anything about Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh and his followers, I wondered if you could just give us some insight into the workshops that you were offered whilst you were staying near the ashram.
So you were really advised to take workshops. That was sort of the first thing when you went in and said, "Hi, I've arrived from something or somewhere, wherever I've come from," because that was the way to get in. That was sort of the door. And so you were told which workshops to take, and also Bhagwan himself would tell you sometimes which ones to take. When you became a sannyasin, which was the opportunity to sit in front of him and have a moment of conversation. And because the viewpoint of the person going is, wow, everything here is cosmic and intended for my evolution and higher good, we projected that, of course, these workshops were going to be perfect for whatever I need. And I attributed a lot of wisdom to Rajneesh, and it certainly felt as if he could see me, in a deep way. So of course, when he named certain workshops to people, you would think, that's what that person needs. But of course, the other side of it is he had the list of how full they were and which ones needed some more people. So that, of course, was a factor. So they usually started off with some more encounter group type of workshops, and then moved to more meditative. And the encounter groups could be very dramatic, and there was a lot of violence and sexuality condoned and promoted, which was sort of coming to an end when I was there. There was this film called Ashram, which was a very shocking film of violence in an encounter group, which was actually even somewhat staged to make it look even more dramatic than it was, because that wasn't really considered a bad thing at the time. I mean, I'm a therapist, so right now, the thought of violence and sex in groups is like, oh my God, that's a terrible thing to happen. But again, I think what was going on there was not so hugely different to what was going on in a lot of other growth centers, and certainly at psychotherapy conferences I'd been to. It was just on steroids because there were no limits, because the guru was allegedly in charge of everything and said, no, nothing goes on here without my knowledge. So a group or workshop leader would have the feeling that Bhagwan knew, we called him Bhagwan, knew what was going on, so they could go all the way. So for me, being really interested in this, and really partly choosing this from my mind, thinking, I'm a really repressed person, kind of shut down with my English heritage. I think I could use a little breaking open. And I would say for me, I actually have a very positive feeling of what went on, scary and challenging though it was. I think it helped me learn a lot about myself. But I also would say it was highly irresponsible, because a lot of people were harmed. And those are the people we don't hear about. Those are the people who left and are wandering the streets of Bombay, high on acid, or, you don't do that to fragile egos. You don't do that to people who've been traumatized in the past and might have this be happen again through an autocratic group leader. So, no, I have very mixed feelings about them now, but I have to also say there was a lot of the positive in my personal experience.
A lot of this stuff around the sexual experiences as well. And when I first read the first opening pages of the book, I was kind of shocked at your honesty. Just in the first few sentences, I was like, whoa, okay, so we're just kind of jumping straight in there. It's such an honest and open book, which is kind of a reflection of your journey as a sannyasin, and to have those experiences of becoming that open person and kind of laying it all out there for everybody. And to tell this story in the way that you did wouldn't have been possible if you weren't so open and honest about all of those things, and so crass and in the way that you explored them, especially when it came to talking about the workshops that you took part in. And it almost felt like with the sexual experiences that you had, you agreed to those, and it almost felt like you were obtaining back some of that power that you lost in Morocco, because you were making these decisions independently to be sexually active with the other people who were all being sexually active in the workshops too. So is that kind of how it felt for you when you were taking part in the different workshops?
It did. And I think that's also coming out of feminism as a kind of relatively new thing. I think a lot of us felt like, to really claim our female sexuality, we can be just as promiscuous as men, which in retrospect is not really a great way to handle sexuality, because it can be very harmful and can lead you into very unpleasant experiences. But it was also within a safety net of these were other people on the same journey. So when there were sexual relationships, in my experience, I was choosing them, and there was a power to that. And I think you're right. To me, it directly correlated to the rape. And in my personality, I think there was a recovery of, to hell with this, I'm going to be in charge of what I do. which actually a policeman once said to me, that when people were raped, he found they often either avoided sex a lot or they went really into it. And I thought that was very interesting because you don't often hear about the latter side. So for me, it was, an opening to, I was always more interested in finding love and romance than in, having vast amount of sex, but there was a lot of sex there. It was that's why it got called a sex cult. And although for me that was a great deal of fun, I also need to voice that is not true for everyone. If you're in a situation where there's so much promiscuity and sex is just condoned so much, they're going to be people who are very hurt and damaged, and they may not be speaking up, and they may not be writing memoirs. So I just want to name that.
And of course, the sexual encounters and experiences that you had were not the universal experience that you had. It's one small part of the overall journey that you went through. It was just one part that I wanted to focus on, because I wanted to ask you the question. During the book, there are a lot of difficult moments where you're encouraged to love everybody. And so being in monogamous with one other person, it's kind of, it doesn't really feel like it works during your journey. And there are some moments where you find it extremely difficult to be so connected and so in love with somebody who is themselves having multiple partners, and you're having those partners come up to you and tell you that the person that you love is great in bed, and you're like, yes, I know that. And I wonder, do you feel then that maybe humans are built to be in one relationship at a time, or maybe just the way that we are conditioned in the way that we have been brought up in the countries that we have lived in? Because I feel like it didn't work for you all of the time to be with somebody and to share that person with other people. But also, I can't imagine, like, when I think about my partner, kind of like even kind of being on an emotional relationship with somebody else, that kind of makes my stomach turn and makes me feel really uncomfortable and anxious. And of course, when you have those difficulties in the book, it's put down to you not surrendering yourself enough, and you needing to put more work in because of jealousy and negative feelings that you have because the person you love is being intimate with somebody else in front of you. It's like a whole thing. And I just wanted your opinion really on whether you think humans are built to be with other partners, or whether the way that we've been brought up in our own countries has an impact on how we feel about monogamy or relationships with many partners.
Well, I think it's both. I think there's a biological factor that goes into procreation, and the need for a significant other, whether that's homosexual or heterosexual. But there's a huge cultural factor as well, because there are cultures where there's polyandry and polygamy, and that's considered the norm. I think at the time in the 70s, we were really experimenting and making that assumption that, this is all cultural and it's being imposed, and this isn't how it's supposed to be. The family doesn't have to be a couple and children. It can be a whole village. So to me, in retrospect, that was going against biology, and especially the parental bond being really minimized. But again, I go back to other cultures. There are cultures where the parents are not the ones focusing on the children. The parents are the ones who hand out the bringing up to aunties and uncles. There's a cultural element, but it's also I think, a physiology and a need to be, for me, was a need to be safe. And I felt like the free sexuality, in retrospect, was also a way to avoid actual intimacy for me. And in a cult situation, it's more complex because the perceived intimacy is with the leader, and that we were all there, and that was our primary bond. So when you were with a partner, you were sharing something with your partner, but your primary bond was with Rajneesh. Intimacy to me is something that I felt like it's taken me a great many years to actually figure out how I was avoiding it in some ways. And I think avoiding it through this false intimacy of being in love with everybody because they're my family in the commune doesn't really hold up over time, because there are other relationships that are actually more personal. Like the intimacy with the guru is kind of false because he doesn't know you, and you probably don't really know him. There's so much projection involved. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's certainly part of my journey is exploring those very questions you're raising and coming to the place of, oh, well, actually, I'm not messed up because I want to be with one partner. That's maybe actually okay. And, jealousy is not great fun, but I think it's kind of natural when you really care about someone, if you don't take it to really obsessive lengths. So my journey of coming to peace and understanding with myself is really accepting that, throwing out this bullshit that we were supposed to be able to be perfectly happy with our partner screwing everybody.
It does answer the question. It answers it perfectly well, and I think it's just perhaps it's a bit of both, cultural and personal, and another thing that you kind of touched on just then that I think is very prevalent in a lot of these cult-like situations is that, of course, a lot of the time one-on-one relationships aren't encouraged because your dependency should only be on the leader or those in positions of power. And if you find that your intimate relationship brings you that safety and brings you that comfort or dependency, which maybe sometimes with this type of work is seen as a weakness and you need to work on it because you shouldn't be dependent on anybody. But of course, if you have a partner that you can lean on, then your allegiance to the leader will be less because you're not dependent on the leader. And as soon as that dependency on the leader exists, it's kind of then like, well, I can't be in a relationship with just one person because that then breaks down that entire system that's in place, at least in a lot of these situations that we see. So, and a lot of the time as well, having that take on sex, it's often what draws a lot of people into the group that may not have necessarily been drawn to the group otherwise. And this kind of reminded me of an interview that I did with a lady called Daniela, where she talked about the Children of God movement that she was born into, and how if people are being told that you can be closer to Jesus and God and kind of continue your spiritual journey by living out these less than legal or moral or ethical relationships with children, then that's going to bring a whole host of people into that movement that may not have considered Christianity to start with, because it's not, I don't know, it's a whole thing that's kind of going around in my mind, and I have all of these
Yeah.
thoughts, and I can't, like, everybody will already know by now that it's really hard for me to like formulate what I'm trying to say. But yeah, that kind of brought that part of that interview with Daniela back to me as well.
Yeah, it can invite predators, I think you're saying.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Absolutely. Yeah.
And that might be hard for people to even notice if they're so busy with their own personal growth and own pleasure.
Yeah.
They might not know what else is going on.
And in a place like the ashram that you've explained to us, and the way that you paint it in the book as well, there's absolutely no way that there could be any predators in that environment. And of course there probably were, but
right,
there's no way that there could have been, because it was such a beautiful place. And the way that India is kind of explained by people that have been and not enjoyed it, it's that it's not a great place to visit, that it's quite dangerous, that it's quite unclean. But the way that you explained it it reminded me of when I went to Athens, which I know they're nothing like one another, but it kind of gave me that bohemian vibe, where I went to Athens and it was during their financial crash, which I know they're still feeling the effects of today, but everything was like, all the shutters were down, but everything was covered in bright spray paint. Everything was spray painted, and there were just dogs everywhere, and there were just people out on the streets just drinking, and nobody was working, and everyone was like, why would I work if this is what's happening to our country? So everybody was just like drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, and there was just people painting everything everywhere. And I was like, whoa, this is like nowhere I've ever been in my life. And everybody was like, oh, I'm uncomfortable with this. And I was like, this is amazing. Look at these people. And that's kind of like the same vibe that I got from you when you got to India, and you were just kind of like, wow, look at this place. This is incredible. But then on the flip side of that, because it's a lot of sort of air quotes hippies that are going to kind of meet Rajneesh and follow him, like there's often this perception of hippies that they aren't clean because they're traveling all the time and hitchhiking all the time and going from place to place, and maybe like, haven't had the chance to like shower in all of these places that they've been in, and all of these stereotypes that come with the hippie movement. But the ashram is like so clean. It's like the cleanest place in the whole book.
And that was part of the culture too, that the hippies joining in and becoming sannyasins, also that you got to be clean and be as, for the workers, work was always to be done as beautifully as possible, and everything should be reflective of beauty and your commitment and love. So you're right, that's probably how hippies came in, and there were few on the trail that had seen a lot of kilometers, but once people were involved, they had the long hair, but you weren't allowed to smell. And there were people who sniffed you before you went in to be with Bhagwan, allegedly because of his sensitivities to allergies to smells. But that was also sort of a cultural way of discerning who could come in and who couldn't, and keeping people out.
Yeah, I laughed at that part where you talked about people like the sniffers. Oh, here come the sniffers. And there'd be two people that were assigned to actually go along and sniff everybody's heads. I just thought that was like a very, again, another lighthearted moment of the book that made it easier to consume when it got to the more difficult things. But eventually you do have your first meeting in person with Rajneesh, 1-to-1.
Right.
And how is that for you? That's a big monumentous thing at that time. It's like everything's been leading to that one moment, and kind of just talk us through how that was for you. How did you feel? What was your reaction?
I was terrified, and I'd already seen him in lecture, and I'd felt really, really excited, and no longer had any doubt about making the commitment. I was ready to make this commitment. So the first meeting was going to a smaller group than the big public lecture, where he gave people their malas and their new names, and had a little chat. And so to me, it was like suddenly I was just with him and he was looking at me. He had his incredible deep brown eyes. And so sitting in front of him with a sense of really being seen. And I felt like he could see my terror, and the things he said to me were so gentle and so just reaching out gently and touching into who I was. And he gave me my name and told me the meaning of it and so on. I just felt, yes, he was all that I was expecting him to be. I was not disappointed.
And he gave you your name?
Right, and put the beads around my neck, yeah.
And what was the name that he gave you?
He gave me Ma Deva Nicola. So Nicola was my name to start with. And then every woman was called Ma, and then Deva was like divine, sort of felt like my sannyasin family name, sort of. So even that was a relief, because he could have given me all kinds of really weird, bizarre names. And to get my own name back was like, oh, thank God, I wasn't ready to go any further. I'm just on the very tippy edge of joining this thing. Don't push me too far. And I felt that giving me my name back was also him being very gentle. And he sort of quoted the Lord's Prayer back to me. And I felt like, oh, he sees that I'm somewhat conservative, shy person, really.
So after your initial meeting and interaction with Rajneesh, you're then sold on the movement. You've become a sannyasin, and you're ready to commit yourself further to the work and to Rajneesh himself.
Right.
And how long do you stay in India before you go back to? Is it Canada? You go back to Canada for a while?
3 months. I think that was probably how long the visa was. And then before you left, you got to have another meeting with him. And that to me was, an energetic experience. It was something we called energy darshan, where he touched you and he had all his mediums arranged all around, and the lights were flashing, and the band was playing, and all the lights went out on the whole ashram. And it was an incredible force of energy that gave me an experience that was very transcendental, that I go into in the book. And at the end of that, I've passed out. It was so powerful. But at the end of that, it was like, oh my God, what was that? I need to get some more of that. It just felt like I'd been taken to this place that correlated with any idea I had of transcendence or enlightenment or spiritual furthering. So it felt like it was a cementing of my bond, because before that, maybe I would have gone back to a job or something, I don't know. But after that, it was like, I have to get back here. Whatever it takes, I am going to come back and be with him more. So I left with that intention and went to really where I could earn money. And that took me back from England I went back to Canada and got involved in various communes there, because the communes are around the world. So my plan was to work and earn money and get back to India. And little did I know that in the interim, Rajneesh would leave India and move to the United States, just down the coast from where I was living. I was living in Vancouver at that time. So it felt like, oh, another miracle. I don't have to save the money for India. He's come to me. I just have to find a way to get to Oregon.
And I've heard a lot about there being, there's an like an Osho meditation center here, and there's a meditation center here and here and here, and the kind of the words meditation center to me kind of paint a picture of an official building that kind of has a plaque on the wall that says meditation center, or some kind of indication that it's a building dedicated to Rajneesh and the work that happens around his practices. But that's not actually true, which I found out in your book. You just have to send off some paperwork somewhere, and it could basically be like, in this house, I could call my house a meditation center.
Well, it's changed over time, so I have no idea what it actually is now. But this whole hierarchical structure went through a very big evolution. So when he first started having Western disciples and he sent them back to the West, or they left to go back to the West, he said, go and essentially it's a version of spreading the word, go and open meditation centers or go and talk to people and share the kind of meditations that he had evolved. So there were some that were just, someone's little house, and they wrote to Pune and said, I'd like to start a meditation center. And then you got the name, and you could start to sell books and have meditations. Or there were others that became very large and very well known. And so in the era we're talking about, it was all pretty loose and pretty fun, because it was like, yeah, I think I'll just start myself a meditation center and let's explore this. And hey, I think I'll hold a tantra group. Or there was this light-hearted exploration. But after he moved to the United States, the hierarchy of the whole organization really started this process of tightening up. So one of the things it did was suddenly start to change the meditation centers into a top-down thing, where they were under more control, if not a lot of control, from what was then became Oregon. And they were then condensed so that all the little ones in people's houses were told to amalgamate and just move to central ones. There was one in England called Medina, and there was one in Holland, and I think one in somewhere in Germany. And they became like mini versions of the ranch with the same rules and the same organizational structure that we did. So this era of meditation centers, it was a specific, 1970 something to maybe very early 80s, where I thought it was a real fun, exciting, free floating thing. And that changed pretty rapidly.
So you've gone to Vancouver, you're saving up some money to go back over to India. You desperately want to get back over there, and you're living with fellow sannyasins who are all trying to save up money to go back over there as well. And you're all fundraising for each other and going to each other's shows and helping each other out. But then you find out that Rajneesh is going to come to you. You only have to go a few miles to get to him, as opposed to kind of, going back over to India. So how and when are you invited over to Oregon? How does that all happen?
Well, I fell in love with someone in Vancouver who lived in Berkeley. So I ended up moving to Berkeley, knowing that it was a lot closer to Oregon than Canada was. So it was from the Berkeley commune that I ended up getting an invitation, meaning, it's not like, dear Nicola, will you come? It's like they sent to the center leader, probably, we need 20 people who are good workers and legal to be in the States or something like that. So I ended up going to the ranch in 1982. So I was 27 by the time that particular phase began.
And what did the ranch look like when you first got there?
It's an extraordinarily desolate place, and that's very, very important, I think, in picturing it, and very hard to picture because it's so remote. You drive miles and miles and miles, like Portland's the nearest big city, but you drive several hours from there and then some, and then some more, and then some more. And the land is very arid. And when you finally get to this tiny little village of Antelope, population 40, there's still another 19 or 20 miles to go down a dirt road into the ranch. And the ranch is approximately 100 square miles. I don't know what that is in kilometers, but it's really big. And a lot of it's very, very arid. So you're driving along a bumpy, muddy road for another 45 minutes or something, and then finally down into a valley in the center. And at the time I was there, it was still very small. So there were only a few hundred people, but suddenly there are all these people in orange. And then, and maroon, keep using orange generically, but it's not only orange. In fact, less orange. It was much more appropriate to Oregon. And suddenly they didn't have long hair and robes anymore. They were in construction boots and some clean, very clean cut farmer carpenter looking people.
It's funny that you said that you were there and it was relatively small at that time, because there were only a few hundred people, which is significantly more than what you just said was the population of the nearest town, which is kind of like really hard to wrap your mind around, really.
That's right.
And from anybody that's watched the documentary on Netflix, Wild Wild Country, that does some coverage of the movement, but focuses a lot on the Rancho Rajneesh and Antelope and the residents of Antelope. It's incredible to see this place be built. It really is like absolutely like, or just even from the telephone lines to the sewerage systems and everything is this land goes from looking like uninhabitable to just being completely built from the ground up, and it really is like incredible to watch, and it must have felt the same way to be part of something like that.
Absolutely. And there's a certain ownership, because everyone says, oh, you poor things, you work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, year in, year out. And there's some hardship in that, but for the most part, it felt like I was building my own house. I was building my own city. These were my people, and like doing the biggest theater show you can imagine. So a lot of it was incredibly joyful. And when you got home at the end of the night, all your clothes had been washed. They were folded on the bed, and your room had been cleaned, and the meals that you'd eaten had all been prepared. So there was a certain amount of daily life stresses that were absolutely absent. So it's not quite the hardship that people picture necessarily.
Something interesting that you said before about the change in hierarchy and the switch up of the way that everything was working, in terms of it being quite broad and liberal, to actually we would like some structure now. So, these various meditation centers need to all come together. There should be leaders. And then going over to the ranch, very much the same situation seemed to come into play. Do you feel like that happened in conjunction with Maranand Sheila coming into the picture? Do you think there's any kind of alignment between that and the way that things happened?
Well, it's in conjunction because she was his secretary at the time, but he chose her to be his secretary at the time because she'd lived in the United States, and she's a real doer and let's go get this done, and we're not going to stop at anything to get this done. But I don't know if you're also asking if she's the one personally responsible for the changes. And I think that's the $1 million question that you'll get a lot of discussion and argument about. It was a need, I think, to make this work and make this function. And then certain things had to look a certain way and happen a certain way in order for it to get off the ground. Like they needed money, they needed organization, they needed certain skills, they needed, at least initially, to appear like we were hardworking ranchers. So that was part of the structure. And how do you get all these people to put all their effort into building a city? But we were doing it because we felt we were part of Bhagwan's dream and privileged to be part of that. And we wanted to make it happen. And it just so happened that he wanted a city and was building a city. And he kept talking about this new commune for years preceding that there was going to be a new commune. The new commune was going to be where the new man, rather sexist language, but that's what it was called. The new man was going to evolve, and this experiment with communal living and non-possessive partnerships, etc., was all going to be part of that. So the structure was how it was taking place. But I think for most of us, we would have done whatever the structure had been set up as. I made a comment in the book about if he wanted us to do an oil-powered shoe factory, we would have done that. So to some extent, this is a sustainable community, and which most people can buy into, they're building a utopia and they're trying to be sustainable. No, that was all great. But I also thought that was sort of the PR of here we are building a model community, whereas really it was more about our personal relationships with him and moving forward in whatever form that was designated.
Do you feel like your personal work and meditations and such kind of fell by the wayside as you became more involved in the building of Rancho Rajneesh?
Well, we were told that the meditation was now our work, and it was renamed as worship. So there was a loss in not sitting silently, and certainly in not hearing him lecture, which he didn't do for the first few years. So in some ways, yes, but it was also, I felt, that I had agreed to that by wanting to go to this next level, because that probably happened for the people in India too, who would become workers. It's like, oh, well, now I'm part of something more significant in the experiment. So the people who came in as visitors got to have the experience I once had. They got to go and pay money and do the groups and so on. But they were all jealous of me because I was a worker who'd been there a while and a resident on the ranch. That was really high status. So yes and no.
How was it when Rajneesh finally came to be with you all on the ranch? How was that? What did it feel? The atmosphere, how did that feel? And what was it like when he finally arrived?
Well, he was there before I got there. He was there in the end of the year before I arrived in the spring, but he was there previous year. And I just saw a film of that event that was sort of shopped around the different meditation centers. And, people were pretty ecstatic that they'd prepared his house and his garden, and he suddenly flew in and was there. So I went to him. He was already in residence when I was there, but not particularly visible because he only came out for what became his daily drive-bys, which became a bit of the way we celebrated. And then later festivals started evolving that he was going to make public appearances at. So it felt like he was always, very much there at the heart of things, but not so physically present, which is how Sheila gets a lot of the rap and focus for the sort of organizational questions you were asking. But the way I see it is she also that was very convenient in as far as criminal proceedings to have someone take the fall. It doesn't mean that he wasn't fairly involved in what went down on a daily basis.
Did you feel distanced from Rajneesh at this point when you're used to kind of having at least sessions where you could go and listen to him talk in person, and then move to Oregon and be in the same vicinity as him, but no longer have access to those types of meditation sessions anymore?
No, I think it really, buying into the commune meant you were really accepting that you were moving into his field. And I felt like his presence was all over the place, even if it wasn't physical. And that's how we saw things too, because he got, oh my gosh, you came from the same place as I came from. Oh, that's amazing. Isn't Bhagwan something that he can engineer this? Like he's this superhuman force field making all these things happen. So the presence was very much there. Plus I could hear his peacocks at night, and I was strutting around his garden. It was that close. It wasn't that he was very far away. And we were getting, tidbits from Sheila. Sheila visited him every day for an hour or so for their meetings. And then she would hold meetings with us and pass on what he'd said and what he wanted to have done differently, and various bits of information. So it didn't feel that he was a long way away, because this was about, and I guess that answers the meditation question too, because there's a certain zoning out if you're into the high of a meditation, sort of a spiritual experience, as I thought of it, which I would attribute to him because I was in the energetic field. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because you're with all these thousands of other people, as it became, who have the same sort of feeling, the same commitment. So there is an energetic field going on, and people driving in would experience that. They would see all these laughing, happy people. I mean, you could see that from Wild Country. It was a force field of a certain kind.
It's interesting there that Sheila's kind of feeding back information from Rajneesh directly at that point as well, because I suppose you're supposed to see Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh as a channel to the divine. So he's kind of like the intermediary between those two things. But now Sheila's become the the interim between Rajneesh and his followers, and then he is then the next step to the divine and the channel between those two things. And it's almost as if by this point the followers are so devout and so believing in Rajneesh and so unwavering in their devotion to him that he no longer needs to make those public appearances, because people do the work for him. Everybody's like, oh, all of this stuff is here because of Rajneesh. He did all of these things for us. Oh, we've been blessed with this bread today because of Rajneesh is with us and he's near us. And it's almost like he doesn't need to do anything anymore because everybody else is doing it for him. If somebody new arrives who maybe didn't go over to India and have those personal sessions with him and have those almost transcendental experiences that you had, there are plenty of people around that have had those experiences that can then bring that person on board, almost through what we talk about a lot on the show around sort of conformity.
And no shortage of photos and videos and footage like that. That was complete immersion, because you weren't seeing photos of other people or watching films about other people.
Something that's happened in a few movements that I've researched as well is that past sessions will be played around the different areas of the commune or the camp on speakers. I don't know if that was something that ever happened on the ranch.
No, you went to hear, it was a specific time something would be played.
Right.
But I guess I also felt like, I don't need to hear that anymore. That's how we got people to come to him. Now I'm in here. This is all about how I witness my thoughts as I'm angry with my boss, or how I witness my thoughts as I'm being more open or less open, and trusting, this crappy boss must be the right person for me to be working with, because Bhagwan knows what goes on. He must have put her in this position, and ascribing all that power to him.
And like you said there, to kind of have that level of trust, it must be quite an exceptional thing, because that moment in the book where the accusations come forward that there are some nefarious things going on sort of on the underbelly of the community, it's almost like implausible and impossible for you to comprehend any of those things that come through. So for anybody that's not familiar with Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh or his movement, I didn't know if you could give us a brief summary of some of the accusations and events that came forward about the ranch itself and some of the things that happened around the ranch.
I would say it took the Way brothers 6 episodes to convey that. So I highly recommend Wild Country, because that's really their focus. They took all the legal and political aspects and exposed that. I went into it in a great deal of detail. And it was something that was very challenging writing the book, because I felt like, oh, this is so complicated. Who the hell is going to be interested in what land use lawsuits we were fighting and what immigration lawsuits we were fighting? And then that documentary came out when I was in the middle of this. And I thought, oh, they actually made it interesting. People care. So briefly, there was a legal war going on all fronts, because people in Oregon were not so happy at this group moving in that behaved very callously to locals, and took over the little town of Antelope and bought people out of their houses and took over their city council. For one of the purposes was the incorporation, because the ranch was not incorporated on as a city. They call them cities. That's just a legal term. So initially, businesses couldn't be run out of a agricultural land. So they wanted Antelope to be able to have bookshops and sell things. So that was the sort of part of the motivation of that, while the construction and so on was going forth to try to get the city built and incorporated, all the while sort of pretending it wasn't going to be a big city, which a lot of people didn't believe, including us. It was pretty clear. Rajneesh had said for ages, I want a place all my people can come to. And it was pretty large. I mean, there were thousands of us. And when we started having these summer festivals, be 10 to 15,000 more coming in. I mean, we had the fourth largest transit system in the state of Oregon. I mean, the scale of this is absolutely mind-blowing. So there were attacks on all fronts, from about zoning laws, because we were building on agricultural land, and what about the water table, and wouldn't that use up water that local ranchers needed? And then immigration was looking at some suspicious marriages between Americans and non-Americans. So all kinds of things were going on. And then there was an election due, and it involved having commissioners, local commissioners, who would make decisions on the incorporation of the city. And that's when a little project happened called Share a Home, where suddenly thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, it was 2,000 to 3,000, I think, homeless people were brought in and told, oh, we can give you a home, we can give you shelter. And you can imagine how extraordinary that was in this really isolated community where we'd all going la, 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 and looking at our navels and working very hard, to suddenly have a lot of people, some of whom had come from street gangs and were fairly violent.
Rival street gangs, nonetheless.
That's right. And here we are, this little innocent middle class, not so innocent, it turned out, group. And obviously that was a ploy for election fraud. And it didn't come off in the end. You got to stop me, because these crimes go on forever. So I don't know how many you want me to name.
No, I think you're giving us like a great another great overview of the entire thing. And you did mention again the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country, which I'm not sure if it's still available to watch now, but I'm sure that there is a way to watch it if it's not currently listed on Netflix. But it's a 6-part docuseries about all of the things that you've just mentioned there, and a few other things that basically seal the fate of the ranch eventually. But in the book where you talk about the Share a Home project, it's terrifying to read that from your perspective and know that your kind of safe insular community is about to be infiltrated by people that you don't know. And then in my mind, I was thinking, but I shouldn't feel that way, because I don't want to be in this insular community, but I do feel like I'm kind of invested in it now. And it was a strange thing to read, and then it was stranger for me then, because you actually went on to say out loud, like, I don't feel safe here right now. And I was like, whoa, yeah, that's exactly how I just was feeling then when you were saying that a lot of people were being brought in, and under Reagan's watch, there was a lot to do with mental illness not being treated in the way that it should have been. So a lot of the people living on the streets were people suffering with ill mental health, not receiving the support that they needed, which again puts themselves and others at risk when they're being brought into this community.
Right. And some of them were great. I mean, it's a bunch of people, it's going to vary. And some of them were really happy to be there and were enjoying it. And in some ways, it really did shake up our middle class, largely white complacency. And some people, made friends and lasting relationships with some of the shareholders. And it was indiscriminate. There were people who were psychotic, and there were people taking dumps on the sidewalk or, not in the toilets. And there were people being violent towards women or, pinching bottoms or whatever they were doing on the buses, which we had no experience with before. So that was a shock. I didn't personally work with shareholders, but I know it was a huge challenge for those who were trying to keep some sort of order. But for me, it was a very weird, but what was even worse was how they were kicked out. That there was cruelty in people when the election had passed and various things happened where they changed the law we're examining the law to make it questionable. The sort of ruse that we were trying to use of people can vote because we were taking advantage of the residential status that was not being required at that time. And then suddenly someone caught on and said, we are going to really look at the people who are voting more closely. And suddenly no one's voting anymore. And then suddenly these thousands who'd been told, this is your home. And, they were given clothes, they were given food, they were given medication. There were a lot of bonuses in some ways as winter was approaching. Sheila held a meeting and people were kicked out. And it was the first time I experienced something is really wrong here. This is cruel. This is unkind. We're breaking our promise. There are people being kicked out who didn't want to leave. Not everyone was kicked out, but vast majority. And I later found out that they were also doing very cruel things like taking their coats off the people kicked out. So, just absolutely unjustifiable cruelty, and then dumping people in nearby towns. So that was my first experience of what the hell is going on? This is not loving. This is not kind. This is not who we are. I don't understand.
Kind of, you talk a bit in the book about the cognitive dissonance coming in at that point, having those two thoughts at the same time, sort of like you wanting to remain loyal on your journey with Rajneesh, but also understanding that what was happening to those people was unjust and there had to be a better way to handle that situation. And it's almost like obviously coming across at that point, now we can't use you for your votes. We don't want you here anymore. And it's posed that they are disturbing the peace and being ungrateful for the support and shelter and food and clothing that they had been given from the community. And so that was kind of the reasoning for dismissing the people from the community altogether.
Right. Yes.
Which it was another part of the book that was uncomfortable to read, kind of just imagining and knowing that that's not really the reason. It's like like a scapegoat, really, like hiding behind the real reasons that you don't need those people there anymore.
Right. It was part of the web of lies, starting to see, I've gone along with, certain things like saying, we don't have that many people living here when we actually did, or these tents are just for the summer when clearly we wanted them to last longer, those sorts of things, lying, publicly, should anyone have ever come in to ask me, but we sort of knew what we were supposed to say to maintain a certain reality. And I was buying into that initially, feeling like the most important thing is that we build the city and we protect everyone. Okay, I can say there's only 400 of us here when there are actually 800. I'm good with that. And then suddenly that coming to a different level of a lie being put out there that was clearly a lie. Like we ever wanted to suddenly help the homeless. That was not Rajneesh's approach. So clearly there was something else going on. And then that was proven by how they were treated. But it was a situation of, I couldn't actually say that to people outside my intimate group whom I trusted to be able to say questioning things like that.
We talked briefly about the events that seal the fate of the ranch, which is something I think I'm going to leave to people to go and read Nicola's book to find out exactly what those things are, or to refer to the documentary, in terms of, because that's where it gets very complicated. There's a lot of he says, she says that starts to happen between Rajneesh and Sheila, and it's hard to kind of, without all of the information of things that have been happening in the background this entire time that the community is being built, that's kind of where it starts to get quite confusing and very much like unbelievable, almost like a Hollywood movie, with some of the things that start to happen next, with the attempts of murder and everything that happens with the food and all of that stuff. But when was it for you, Nicola, that you decided to leave, and why?
Okay, well, to try and cover a little bit of that, was that criminal activities were exposed, and not just any old criminal activities. There were, egregious attempted murder and poisoning, including over 700 people in restaurants in the Dalles, that salmonella was spread there. So these were horrific things. And those homeless were drugged with Haldol in their beer, which, we'd been told, oh, you can't eat in that cafeteria anymore, but no one knew why. So to me, these were terrible, terrible things that it's hard to absorb. And it was very hard for us to absorb because of the cognitive dissonance of, well, that's insane. We're here making the world more loving. And Sheila left with her elite group sort of in the night. I don't know if it was actually in the night, but none of us knew until the next day. And then Rajneesh was the one who sort of told us what are these things that had been going on. But he claimed that she was responsible for everything and he didn't know anything about it. And I realized that you're being very cautious about making allegations. But I was rereading Frances Fitzgerald's article in the New Yorker right at that era, and she described it as only after they left, that's Sheila and her group, did sannyasins dare to go to Bhagwan and tell him about the crimes these people had committed. This is according to Bhagwan. He had not known anything about them before. Sheila had deliberately kept him uninformed. And to quote Frances Fitzgerald, she says, the story was, of course, not remotely plausible, and goes into why. So she certainly knew of something. I'm not going to get into what and how much, but for example, the Sharer home, he could hardly be on his own ranch going out every day without seeing a few thousand new faces. So that was all underway. But the question of what did he know and who was responsible and what did Sheila do, was haunting all of us, because there were some crimes that took place that seemed clearly to be Sheila's responsibility, like poisoning Bhagwan's doctor. He wouldn't have done that. And I'm not saying that he did anything. I'm just saying that it's unlikely that he didn't know. He was very involved in a lot of the details of our daily lives. But that's for each person to figure out and come to their own conclusions. But meanwhile, this thing called cognitive dissonance, when you try to find room in your mind for two conflicting things, we can explain initially, oh, well, I don't like the fact that they've started to have weapons on the ranch. How is my brain going to make sense of being a peace love group and have weapons? Oh, but it's to protect us because the outside is out to get us and Bhagwan's life might be in danger. So you resolve the cognitive dissonance through rationalization. But when it came to the extreme of Bhagwan telling us there've been attempted murder and poisoning and thousands, no, not exaggerating now, with hundreds of people have been hurt, both on and off the ranch, the level of cognitive dissonance was unbelievable because it was two huge parts of the brain very, very confused, because how could I hold Bhagwan, whom I loved and represented peace and transcendence and all kinds of great things to me, how could I hold him responsible for criminal acts? And a lot of people didn't and said, no, well, we'll buy it. It was all Sheila. She did everything. But in my mind, well, he's responsible because he's head of the organization, if nothing else. He appointed Sheila. He knew who he had in place. He was pretty happy with her, most of what we heard. So trying to make sense of these contradictions was agonizing. And it really felt like I might lose my mind. And looking at the dazed faces around me, we were all processing this stuff that shattered our belief system, because we'd gone into this with the understanding of we were in a spiritual enterprise that was challenging belief systems that had been imposed by society, that we were questioning belief systems in order to find what was really true. And we all bought into that. And we were thinking we were getting unconditioned from social conditioning. So it's gradually was dawning on me of, oh, another belief system walked in there while I wasn't noticing. How bizarre is that? I thought I didn't have a belief system, but I do. I believe that, Bhagwan can't do any harm or whatever it was. I believe that. And now that's being challenged. I must have formed another belief system. So it was really like the structure of reality itself was being challenged and crumbling, and really scary to try and figure out, what was what and who did what and who was responsible and how do I maintain my love for this guru? How do I maintain my understanding that I had these great experiences, or did I? So everything was out there. So you ask when I left, but I didn't really leave. He left. He, first of all, tried to leave sort of surreptitiously, and then was caught and imprisoned and came back, and then made a plea bargain and left. And I was still there, and thinking that I had only been there for him. But my experience was when he left was, oh, well, it's still a great place. This is still home. These are still my people. Yeah, I think I'll stay. And because he'd said a lot about letting go of the hierarchy and the way Sheila had run things, it looked like, oh, we could actually get more democratic. This could be better in the end. And then we were told, no, because of all the lawsuits, the ranch couldn't be continued. We all had to leave. So basically, I was kicked out. So I left in, I think it was December or getting on for the winter of 1985. And still in this process of not understanding and trying to figure it out and what happened, which was a process that continued for some time afterwards for me.
There's something that you mentioned there about having those two conflicting ideas or belief systems, realizing that there is another belief system in place that maybe you hadn't realized was there. It's very interesting for you to have that realization and to talk us through having that realization, because being in that insular community, in that rural place, kind of in the middle of nowhere, in this kind of vast ranch that is Rajneesh, and everything is Rajneesh, and all of the conversations at that point with everybody must have been around what was true, what wasn't true, as you said, trying to figure all of those things out. There's no place to go that's not around that situation. So there's no chance for you to shut your mind off and give yourself some rest from it, because as soon as you maybe distract yourself with a menial task, there's somebody else coming to you saying, oh, what about this and this? Do you think this is true, or that couldn't have happened? And it's almost like there must have been no chance for you to have any breathing space. So then for you to have that realization that there is another belief system there, or you are kind of agreeing and disagreeing with yourself at the same time, it's maybe something that was always there but had been buried through the work that you'd been doing, and had just through some of the things that Sheila and Rajneesh had gone on to do and say, that small thing kind of had a chance to come back to the forefront a little bit and gain or regain some space in that kind of conversation and in a monologue. So for you to have that realization and then talk us through how that is like, it's like layers and layers of the complexities of the mind.
Yes, my head hurts.
Yes, and it's just that it's like another one of those cycles that just goes round and round and round, because then you kind of ignore that belief system because you're here because you believe in Rajneesh and you're there to be with him and his community and world that he wants to build. But then why would he let these things happen if that's the community he wants to have, and so on and so forth. Yes. Until you don't really get any answers. But of course there is a moment in the book where Rajneesh speaks to you all directly and starts to openly talk about radical ideas that do not fit with his message or ideologies or things that he had told you were his visions of the future. And so that's kind of what I meant by your snapping moment. And I know that people have different words for it, sort of like the veil being lifted, or the rose-tinted glasses come off, or whatever way people have experienced this. They wake up and but the kind of snapping moment where you realize that, oh, actually this is something's very wrong and I don't know if I want to be here anymore. And that's the first time you actually said it kind of out loud. How was that for you to kind of go through that?
Well, it was devastating. I mean, I saw him behave in ways that to me looked pretty wacko, like he was kind of unraveling a bit, which could not be in greater contrast to his usual, presentation of being, so visibly, physically. I found him very physically beautiful, but always maintaining this calm, decorum, loving persona. And suddenly I saw him getting angry and petty and vindictive and just looking like, oh, he's someone who's flipping out because he doesn't like people questioning the reality that he's put forth. And so that to me was a shattering. You read about, how do people change their attitude to cult leaders, and there is this sort of shattering of the veneer when suddenly you see, oh, well, this is actually a human being who's flawed. And I could see, he does get angry. Oh, he does get petty. Oh, he does get vindictive.
And he definitely does have an ego as well.
Yes. Yeah. And is greedy. And so it puts everything into question, because like the Rolls Royces, for example, we were told, this is a device to push people's buttons who are so uptight about money. And then suddenly I thought, maybe he's just greedy. Maybe he just likes Rolls Royces. So seeing him become more human and not necessarily a terribly nice human, certainly not caring. When I heard him, be vindictive about a sannyasin who'd questioned him, that was like, oh my God, he can't stand just hearing that. Now I'm a psychotherapist and I see that, as a narcissistic personality that has a certain grasp of reality, and it's intolerable when that's challenged. And so I can imagine No, he was not happy that Sheila left. He was not happy that the people he had running things were not there anymore. I don't know, but I'm just surmising that. So it was, devastating, but I didn't let go of, oh, but I still love him, and oh, but I still think he's enlightened. And I heard someone say this not very long ago, who was trying to put together certain behaviors they'd heard about Rajneesh with their experience. They were still more involved than I, and said, can you be a narcissist? No, can you be a psychopath and enlightened at the same time? And it was like, I could see this friend trying to put together those two aspects, and try to make some sort of sense of it. And you can talk to all kinds of people, and you'll get very different answers of how we each made sense of it. So I'm very clear in my book that this is my story. I'm not telling his story. I don't know what his motivations were, and I certainly don't want to get into discussing what enlightenment is or isn't. But in my mind, that wasn't very kind, and that wasn't very good. And going back, I could see, oh, but things were not good from that moment I saw cruelty happening to the Sheraton people. I had something inside me that was splitting from this, we're all one, I'm joined in everything. And that split continued. And then I gradually began to recognize and honor it.
And I feel like that's very in keeping with you as a person throughout your entire story, because you're looking for this acceptance and love and community, and a place where you can be open and connect with people on a deeper level, because you'd been so disconnected and you'd been so shut down, and people had told you that maybe you take yourself too seriously. So as soon as you start to, it's almost like you see that shift in this, you'd found all of those things, and as soon as those things started to turn into other things, that's when you realize that you no longer fitted into that world. So it's very much like you're very loyal to yourself throughout the whole way. You look for that community, you find that community, and when that community shifts into something else, that's when you start to realize that maybe that's not the community for you anymore. And I thought that was a really important thing to look at, and realize that even though you'd been through this process and you'd been a part of building this thing, you always stayed true to yourself, and we are our most important allies at the end of everything. So I thought that was quite an important thing as well.
Well, I think, though, if I had been able to be true to myself, I would have stood up at the Share a Home program and said, this isn't right. I like your vision of me, but I think it may be a little golden, because I was scared. Because if you stood up and said, this isn't right, you would be kicked out. And I didn't want to be kicked out. So it's a bit like, a relationship that, when you finally get out of a relationship, you think, oh God, I should have left that years ago. Why did I stay? The attachment is so strong that you keep justifying things. And I think I did stay longer than I would have if I'd been able to be true to myself. But I think I gave a lot of myself away because I wanted the belonging. I wanted the community. I didn't want to go into this world that we were told was so hostile and dangerous. I had zero money, like absolutely not a penny. I didn't know how to get to the front gate if I had wanted to leave. So I was not as free as I would like to have thought.
Yeah. Again, it comes back to that conversation around dependency, though. I mean, there's probably a reason all of those things happen so systematically. And there is a point in the book where you do stand up and talk, about how you think and feel. And somebody then says thank you to you for doing that. So you do need to also cut yourself some slack for that as well, because you said there, I would have stood up and voiced my opinions on what was happening to these people when they were being turfed out of the community. But it takes some time, but you do eventually, that does happen. You do stand up and speak about what you believe in. And I think the fact that it takes time is it's one of those things that it's okay, because you were under so much influence at that point that even for you to have those thoughts about that, this is not right, and not just explaining away what was happening to these people, even though you were kind of doing that still at the same time because you believed in Rajneesh, it's almost like reminding people that it's not their fault that those things happened. If you know what I mean, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So you do stand up for yourself. Not too long after that.
I'll try to let that in, Casey. But coming out is really, as in many kinds of coming out, it's a long, involved process. Because in a way, when you say you do stand up for yourself, I feel like I'm doing it now. I feel like sitting here talking to you. Oh, now I'm going to make myself cry. It just feels like such a significant thing, and it's taken me many years to be able to say, I want to tell my story. And when you're talking about a cult or a minority religious group, however you choose to look at it, you're going to piss people off. I feel like having this conversation with you and publishing my memoir is an enormous risk. People are going to hate me for saying my truth, because they'll take it as an insult to their belief system and their beloved guru. But I feel like while I'm on the planet and while we're all on the planet, we have a right to tell our stories, and it's important to. And it does upset me that the Osho movement, which I don't know much about and I haven't been involved in, but from what I understand, they're really pretty divorced from Oregon and Rajneesh. And I met an Indian who'd been to the ashram in Pune not long ago, and he had no idea that Osho and Rajneesh were the same person. And so I don't really like that whitewashing of history. Whatever wonderful experiences people may have had with Osho since, and however, I feel like I want to respect people's own journeys, and I'm not going to mess with anyone's belief system, but I want to be able to tell my experience without the fear of their censure stopping me, and without the fear of the organization stopping me. And that's held a lot of us back. And I feel like if I can do it, that's also encouraging other people to tell their stories who had much worse experiences than I did. I had a pretty positive experience, but I'm a therapist. I work with cult survivors, among other people, and I've seen a lot of damaged folks. And I think it's up to us who maybe have a voice and like writing and can get someone like you to listen to them, to tell the stories. And I'm grateful for this opportunity.
It's incredibly important that there are people like you who are willing to sit down and be vulnerable and go through the motions of telling your story, though, because it's not just, I know that the book is called A Slice of Orange, and the main bulk of the book is around your journey in India and Oregon, but it's also about other experiences that you've had that are so important to highlight and to empower other people, to allow them to have their own voice to come forward and talk about things like sexual assault and rape, and to talk about being in relationships and then having hurtful relationships because those people are having relations with other people, and understanding how difficult it is to grow up with difficult parents. I don't want to give them a word because that's not my place, but to grow up with relationships that are difficult, to even grow up in a religious setting away from home, that the perspective and experience that you've given there may be so different to somebody else. It may give them a chance to realize that not everybody had a really difficult time growing up in a convent, and some people's experiences were relatively positive and they met good role models along the way. Because there are some really difficult stories out there from people that have grown up in religious boarding schools and convents. And even what you said about the performance where you let someone read your work that you had written and you really enjoyed writing, and you had this really vulnerable experience where you allowed somebody to read the work that you had written, and they asked for permission to take your work and to create a physical piece of theatre out of it. And at the same time, you created your piece of theatre out of your writing, and you said you'd perform them at the same time and then compare them. And a lot of it was around the trauma that you experienced in Morocco, and you took that and it felt cathartic, and it was a beautiful performance. And then this person took your writing and almost abused it because he interpreted it in a way that it was never supposed to be interpreted. And he said that was your fault because you should never leave your work open to interpretation. And he took your love of writing away from you for years and years. And now you've written this memoir, and that is a huge thing. And I feel like you are telling people that, you're scared to put your writing out, and you are worried about what other people will think, and perhaps even worried about insulting other people and their own spiritual beliefs. But at the same time, like, your story is not just about that experience with Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. It is so much more. Somebody took away your love of writing, and having a creative outlet is so extremely important, especially to people that suffer with ill mental health or trauma or PTSD. And for somebody to do that to you, and then for you years later, after all this experience that you had with Rajneesh, to come out of the other end of it and to write a memoir about your life, and to be open with the people that you are allowing to read this work, I think it's just incredible. And I really do think that it's so empowering, not only for you, but for other people who may be thinking about writing or talking about their own experiences. To know that you've had these experiences yourself, where you have been shattered, and where you have had your trust broken by somebody who you admired, when he took your work and did something he never should have done with it, and then said it was your own fault. It's just, I think it's great. And I think that if you can talk us through all of these experiences and write a book about it, and then come on to speak with me on the podcast about all of the things, I just think, it's a very positive message for anybody else that may be thinking about telling their story, or wondering about how they can have a creative outlet of their own, even if they've been dismissed in the past. And it's probably a good place for me to mention that earlier, when I said that the book opens and you're very open with your reader about your life and the way that things are, and it has to be that way in order for us to fully appreciate all of your experiences. It's another thing about young people and having these experiences, and even for people that have had similar experiences like that. I mean, your book is just so much more than Rajneesh, and I think it's so important to say that. And it comes back to that thing that I always say about your life is not defined by the time that you have spent in a movement. You don't have to be defined by that in any way. And it's almost like when people say, don't be defined by your diagnosis. I feel like this is the same sort of thing. To not be defined by your abuse or your trauma, and know that it is a part of you, and it's an important part of you, because it has determined who you are now, and how you think and how you feel and how you act or react. But it doesn't have to be everything that you are, because you are so much more than that. Yeah.
And I love what you're saying, and I really appreciate the encouragement and support that you're naming. And it's actually how I came up with the title of the book, because I was explaining to someone, I don't want my book to just be about Rajneesh. That wasn't my whole life. It was just a piece of my life. It was just like a slice of the whole orange. So that's what came out of my mouth.
And obviously it's like a double entendre, because everyone walks around wearing orange, right? or almost everyone wears orange, some kind of variation of. But something else that you said there as well about recovery or reintegration after being involved in one of these groups is that even though you had that moment where you did stand up and voice your thoughts and opinions on something, that wasn't you then, recovered from your experience just because you had that moment. You're still working on it now. You're working on it through your writing. You're working on it through these types of conversations and with your really supportive and loving husband, Ron. It even though it's been a long time since you were involved with Rajneesh, it's still a process that you are working on now. So it's not something people should put pressure on themselves. There's no timeline. There's no deadline. There's nothing that says like, oh, you should be recovered from this experience by this time, because that's not how recovery works. And I feel like that's another important thing to mention, just in terms of you said that you're still working on those things today.
Absolutely. And I still read something and go, oh my God, I didn't know that happened there. And then I have to change my mental structure around it again. Yeah, it's definitely a process. And as a therapist working with trauma, I can see, that often people don't want to touch areas of trauma until a certain amount of time has passed, if ever. And usually they need, an atmosphere of safety and time to, if it comes up, okay, yeah, I think it's time to address that. I think that's still impacting my life. I need to go there. But the time is, very individual.
And when you heard about the documentary coming out on Netflix, was it something that you had been informed of before, or did you just get told about it and then sit down and watch the documentary?
I just read that it was coming in the newspaper or something and had to go out and get Netflix and connect the TV because I was so excited about it, and got together with some other close friends who'd also been in Rajneeshpuram. So we just sat down, and it's the only thing I've ever binge watched. I was absolutely fascinated, even though I know what was going to happen. It's still exciting. I find my own memoir when I'm reading and thinking, oh, there's a certain momentum. This is exciting. What's going to happen? I know what's going to happen. So I thought the documentary was fabulous. And I think it really did what it set out to do, which was explain the whole legal situation and what came down. It's being critiqued, right and left, because it doesn't do everything. And I've talked to people on the ranch going, well, why didn't it explain why we were there? It didn't say enough about us, and we weren't represented, but it had a huge impact, and people loved it. My hairdresser drove to Antelope because she wanted to go see the environment, and fashion trends happened in New York. It was like, oh my God, I was writing the memoir and I thought, are people ever going to be interested in this? And then I saw the reaction to Wild Wild Country and go, oh, I think the answer to that is yes. And then I read some of the online commentary, and people were saying, well, this is very interesting, but we don't know why someone would have been attracted to that, or what happened to all those people afterwards. And I thought, I'm writing about that. I can tell you those answers. So it made me really feel that there was actually a market and an interest, and encouraged me to get on with finishing the book.
And something that me and Ronit spoke about when we were on the show was that she wanted to watch it, but she didn't. And she wanted to look out for her mum, but she didn't. And she kind of was looking at some of the kind of background figures to see if she would do. Were you all looking for yourselves in the documentary? Of course.
I have to stop it all the time and keep, oh, there's so-and-so, oh, there's so-and-so. I didn't see myself, but I saw plenty of other people.
And another thing that we spoke about during our interview is that she's always wondered where were all the kids in the documentary, because of course her mother left her and her sister with her father to go and follow Rajneesh and then to go and live on the ranch. So I wonder if you have any insight into whether there were children, what happened with the children, because a lot of the people you said were sort of 8 years or so older than you when you first joined, and that in my mind would kind of be roughly the average age to have like small children at home. So I don't know if you have anything that you can offer us in terms of information.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And I think the children got a raw end of the deal, because there were many people in Ronit's situation whose parents did not bring them. So they had that devastating loss of being severed from a parent or two parents. And Rajneesh was not particularly supportive of children. And he wanted his people to be available for him and for the work. And so he talked about the children who came, he said were welcome, but it was certainly discouraged, not only to bring them, but to have them. So in India, there were a lot of sterilizations, and people were encouraged to be sterilized. And I was not part of that because I wasn't a worker. So I never felt any pressure. No one ever mentioned that to me. But it was something that was going on. So that shows you that having children was not a very smiled upon thing. And so our birth rate on the ranch, and probably in India too, was zero. There were no children born there. But there were some children. There were about 50, I think roughly 50 kids of different ages. But they didn't get the loving, supportive, nurturing environment with their parents that I would wish any kid. And I think that's one of the things I feel badly about, that the rest of us, were so into our own lives and our own love problems and our own spiritual growth. I really wasn't aware about the kids. I hardly had any interaction, maybe with one or two occasionally. So I think they really got a raw deal out of it. And because they weren't there voluntarily, as in children with other cults, it was their parents that made that decision. So kids, I feel very badly.
Was there like a building that they were kind of, was there any education in place? Did they all live together in one building, or did they kind of go with different caretakers? Do you know of any of the kind of how the logistics worked?
Yeah, they were sleeping in their own quarters, and then the parents took turns, like shifts, and being with them. Right. I mean, they were with their parents sometimes and would come and have dinner with their parents, but they were definitely separated from parents. And then there was a school later on in Antelope, and they attended school, and they had a work school mix. So you could look at that as negative, or you could look at it as positive, because the kids I did come into interaction with were kids working in the video department where I was some of the time. And I sort of thought, oh, isn't that great? They get to follow their interests, and, other kids are working with the horses, that didn't look bad to me. But you could also look at it and go, gosh, these kids were made to work, and they didn't get all the influences that we would like to have our kids subjected to. And there's a couple, if you read My Life in Orange by Timothy Guest, that's a very well-known book. He writes about being a child in Medina in England, so part of the commune system. And he's deceased, unfortunately, but he gives a good perspective on children. And Dickon Kent, I think is his name, wrote in The Guardian this perspective of being a child. So there are a lot of stories there that are not mine to tell, but I think the children really deserve a voice now, because they didn't, if we didn't have one, the kids certainly didn't have one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for offering us that insight and answering those questions. I think I'll be able to go to Ronit and have a nice conversation with her about some of that insight that you've given us. So thank you. And anybody that would be interested in Ronit's work as well, she's written her memoir When She Comes Back, which is it's a coming of age memoir. So it's from her perspective growing up without her mum, because her mum had gone to follow Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. So for anybody that would like to go and read that, that's Ronit Plank's work, When She Comes Back, which has featured on the monthly memoir giveaway on the podcast. So I like to always promote that when I get the chance. But with your writing, you kept journals throughout your life. So you had a good place to recollect or confirm some memories and thoughts that you'd had. And what was your process in terms of writing? Did you know you wanted to write a book? Did you sit down and start writing things and then realize that they were going to turn into something more than they were? What did your process look like?
Well, I've always felt like I was a writer and I wanted to write, and I've always felt very badly about not writing. Like, oh, there's this thing I'm supposed to do and I'm not doing it. And so after the ranch, the journals unfortunately stopped around India. But after the ranch, things just started to come out when I've had a little time, when I took a course here and there and wrote a short story and started mulling some of this stuff over. And then I got more serious and really wanted to write and make time for it. So I created a writing group, and I invited people who'd all said they wanted to write, and did it just so that we would encourage one another. So that was very helpful to me to get going, and a non-judgmental writing group called Creative Souls. And so I started writing, and the philosophy I have is just to let what wants to come out. And I actually didn't know what wanted to come out. And it turned into this enormous, massive autobiography, starting with family history, and it just went on and on and on. And then I felt like, well, now I've written something, but it's this huge, unwieldy mess. What the hell am I going to do to it? So I sought out the help of an editor who said she was good at structural editing. And I said, can you help me find a structure for this? And she was incredibly helpful. Her name's Marnie Friedman. And she helped look at the bones from what I'd written. And she said to me, this is a spiritual memoir. And those words were so helpful because it gave me the guiding thread of, yeah, that is what it is, and helped me sort of define the focus. And then I joined an additional writing group, Read and Critique. So people I didn't know who were more objective. And by that time, I was feeling stronger, so I was ready to receive some critique. And that process has gone on for a number of years. And just then it's whittling away and redoing draft after draft. And last year, I was seriously ill. I spent 7 months in bed with cancer. And so the only thing I could really do was a little bit of editing. I could hardly lift my head, but I did a paragraph a day and just got through the next draft. I couldn't work. I couldn't do my job. So it was like, in a way, what an opportunity to actually slog through a whole large section of it. So that's my whole messy process. And it involves a great deal of rewriting, which I quite enjoy. And I think maybe I would be a much faster writer if I was able to structure things ahead of time, but I've not been so good at that.
And you mentioned before we hit record that your book is with an agent at the moment who is sending it off to all different publishers. So hopefully we'll hear something back at some point about a potential release date.
Let's hope. You're from your lips. Langton International Agency has sent it out to 27 publishers, and I only need one, so light your candles. And if anyone wants to track when that process is going to turn into an actual hard copy book, which I will put into your giveaway supply, please sign up to my website and Instagram, and then I'll keep you informed.
Yes, so you have a website that people can visit and sign up to a newsletter?
Yes, I do. NicolaRanson.org is the website. Yes, sign up and I'll send a newsletter occasionally when I manage to get around to it. And then on Instagram at Nick Ranson, N-I-C Ranson, and Facebook, Nicola Ranson Writer. So one way or another, I will keep you informed. And
yes,
just really hoping for this good energy that some publisher or other will.
I don't see how people can read that and not decide to run with it. I think we'll be hearing some good news sooner rather than later. And I will put all of those links in the episode description as well. So if anybody wants to kind of have the link to the website, they can find it in the description, have a click, go and sign up to Nicola's newsletter. I think there's actually a chapter or part of a chapter available somewhere as well. Did I see on your website?
Well remembered, because I've had 2 excerpts from the memoir memoir competitions in San Diego at the San Diego Memoir Writers Organization. So one of them was performed live. So there's actually a video of that performance on my website, and it's called The Visit. It's when my parents came to visit me for 3 days in Rajneeshpuram, which was one of the most difficult 3 days of my life. So that's there, and you can buy the anthology that it's in. It's called Shaking a Tree. And then next year, there's going to be another episode about one of my Moroccan experiences coming out in next year's anthology. So
that's incredible. It's like multidisciplinary, and I'm here for it. That's fantastic. So that has taken us to the end of our episode. And I think all that there is left for me to say before I ask you if you think we've missed anything is that I wholeheartedly appreciate the opportunity to read your work before it's even printed. It's such a privilege to be able to read what you've written, to be allowed to be a part of those experiences that you've had, to read something that's so raw and open and vulnerable, and to go on that journey with you, and then to have the opportunity to sit here and talk to you about the writing process and your work and those experiences in depth. It's really special for me, and I appreciate the work that you've done for other people, the work that you do as a psychotherapist. It's incredibly important that this work is happening and that people are receiving the help that they need. So there's just a lot to be thankful for. And thank you to Ron. I don't know if he's still listening outside the door, but big thank you to him for his support with you and your creativity and being somebody that's helping you on your journey as you continue to recover. And I think it's just so wonderful that you are willing to come and chat with little old me over here and bring your wisdom to other people who can take what they need from our conversation and hopefully apply it to their own situation. So thank you so much, Nicola.
Oh, Casey, that's very sweet, and I'm incredibly grateful. You know, that there's just so much trauma in the world of various kinds, and you know, isn't it great we can be part of the healing, and you know, what you're giving as an opportunity for people to tell their stories and just be heard is really a wonderful thing to be part of. So thank you so much.
We could just try and tackle the trauma one tiny little bit at a time, and who knows where we'll be sort of 5 or 10 years from now. But thank you so much, Nicola. I really appreciate your time. I can't wait to hear the good news. I have fingers and toes crossed that it will be soon.
All right, I'll let you know.
I really do think that we'll have that, and I can't wait to record an episode and say hello, listeners, just to let you know Nicola's work's going to be published, and that'll be a great day. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, and good night to you, Casey.
Take care, Nicola. Bye.
Bye-bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been The Cult Vault.